You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Hywel Davies, here in London with today's debate. Last week, the US Attorney General, Eric Holder, announced that no one would be prosecuted for the deaths of 2 prisoners held in CIA custody. Gul Rahman died in 2002 at a secret prison in Afghanistan after being bound to a wall in near-freezing conditions. Manadel al-Jamani died in 2003 in CIA custody in Iraq's Abu Ghraib prison, where his corpse was photographed, wrapped in plastic and packed in ice. Eric Holder said there was insufficient evidence to mount a realistic prosecution in connection with either case. That decision means there's now no realistic prospect that anyone will be prosecuted for abuses carried out against prisoners during the presidency of George W. Bush. So is Holder's decision a shocking evasion of responsibility, or is it now time, as President Obama said, to look forward, not back, at the actions of CIA interrogators? I'm joined now by Charlie Wolfe, an American broadcaster currently living in the UK, Richard Norton-Taylor, security editor at The Guardian newspaper, Keith Best, chief executive of Freedom from Torture, a charity that provides care for victims of torture. And on the phone from the United States, we have Alan Dershowitz, Felix Frankfurter professor of law at Harvard Law School, and one of the most prominent advocates of using torture against terror suspects. If I might start with you, Mr. Dershowitz, do you welcome this ruling from Eric Holder?
Well, first let me clarify. I am unalterably opposed to the use of torture under any and all circumstances. I have always been opposed to the use of torture, and you misstate my position. I do, however, favor the use of torture warrants. That is, I acknowledge that torture occurs, even though I'm opposed to it. And if it's going to occur, I want accountability. I want to make sure that not only are the local people who administered the torture prosecuted for it, but the person who signed the torture warrant, the President of the United States, the Attorney General, the high-ranking officials who authorized the torture, if torture is going to occur, are held accountable, because accountability is the essence of democracy. So I believe that we should never, ever, under any circumstances, use torture. I believe we will and have used torture. I believe that every country in the world has used torture and would use torture faced with what they believe was a ticking bomb situation. And because I want accountability, I want to make sure there are torture warrants. I also oppose the death penalty, but I want death penalty warrants before people were executed. But people misunderstand my view as being favorable to torture when I'm unalterably opposed to it and have suggested a mechanism for reducing its use and holding people accountable if torture is ever used, as I'm sure it was in these prisons and when we waterboarded throughout our history.
Going to your point of having warrants, though, aren't they actually a form of legalization in a way? You're giving permission to someone to carry out torture.
No, it's the same view I take on the death penalty. I'm opposed to the death penalty. I think it violates human rights. But I recognize as a realist the fact that it's going to happen. And if it's going to happen, I want to make sure there's accountability for it. I prefer accountability to this myth of if you just abolish torture, it will somehow go away. We've tried that approach for the last 100 years, and it has failed across the board. I'm suggesting it's time for a new approach, that is to recognize that every democracy would and has used torture, and let's make sure if it's done, there's accountability for it so we can hold the right people responsible, not just the lowest people on the totem pole.
May I just come in there? Because I think that is a counsel of despair rather than of realism. Quite frankly, if we're going to have torture warrants and death penalty warrants, are we going to have warrants for slavery? We're going to have warrants for other abuse. I'm afraid slavery is going on in the world today, and if you don't understand that, you're closing your eyes to reality.
I'm talking about in Western democracies, which do have torture. The United States has torture. Great Britain has torture.
Yes, but if you're opposed to torture, then all your considerable intellectual efforts surely should be devoted to ensuring that it is actually eradicated. I mean, I think the Obama administration has much to answer for. One thing it has done is to say it will not do what George Bush Jr.'s administration did, and that is to waterboard people. And I think that that is at least a step in the right direction. The fact is that we know these are torture. We know that from Dianne Feinstein's comments and such likes, and I think it's sad that the Republicans have withdrawn from the Senate Intelligence Committee, but that's a fact of life. But we know from her comments and the evidence that has been gathered so far that there is really no evidence at all to suggest that torture either elicits the truth or indeed certainly did not contribute towards the apprehension and shooting of Osama bin Laden.
Sorry, Charlie Wolf wants to come in here.
Actually, it did. There's a couple of things. First off, going back to Mr. Dershowitz, funny enough, I agree in a large part with him. I'm against torture too. I guess and I'm also, I think, in favor of accountability and warrants, etc. I guess where we would diverge slightly is I don't consider waterboarding to be torture, considering how it was carried out, considering that it was approved by the Justice Department. It wasn't done willy-nilly. It was only done to 3 people. So in other words, people weren't lined up so the troops or the CIA could get their jollies out of watching people suffer. It did have a needed outcome.
It did happen 183 times to a single person in 1 month.
Well, but even then,
that's not torture?
You're talking seconds. Every time he was dipped in the water was considered a time, and it was held under the most rigorous of standards, and it did work. We did get information that did lead to...
How do you know
that? We've seen the papers on it. We've seen the evidence on it.
It's just not there, I'm afraid.
Well,
and all I can say is, I mean, I know and love the United States, and I visit it regularly, very well indeed, but you have far greater faith in your government than I do. If you say that because the government says it's not torture, therefore you believe it's not torture, I'm afraid I actually apply my views more to international instruments and where the community has actually come together and made decisions about whether things are torture or not. Waterboarding clearly is torture, and if you look at the medical evidence there, it's absolutely certain beyond peradventure that it is torture.
No, it
Richard
depends.
Norton-Taylor,
I would say just very quickly.
Excuse me, Charlie. Richard Norton-Taylor's trying to get in.
Well, I was trying to get it. Well, why are we talking about torture now? We're talking about torture now because the George Bush administration and their legal advisors said that torture was okay. That is to say...
No, they didn't say torture. They said waterboarding was okay.
Well, they said waterboarding was okay. They said what is the British and the European Human Rights Court and also the British government says is torture. So we, the British, disagreed fundamentally with one of our closest allies. That's what the British Security Intelligence Services say. They were unprepared, they were worried, they were frightened, they were astonished, they were surprised by what the Americans allowed and indeed, quote, torture, unquote, according to the British. Now, the trouble then is what the British Security Intelligence Services do. They don't blow the whistle, and they connive in one way or the other. We know that. We know that most recently, actually, with the rendition of dissidents to Gaddafi's Libya. Now, there's no evidence, as Keith said, no evidence that torture works, and it's actually counterproductive.
Alan will bring you in after Richard has finished his piece.
One other point, of course, the British Security Intelligence Services are probably quite mealy-mouthed and maybe indeed economical with the truth, because they say, we have to liaise with other intelligence services in the, quote, fight or war or whatever against terrorists. So, for example, in Pakistan or in other countries, some of our closest allies, we send lots of arms to Saudi Arabia and so on. They treat people who in their prisons, which to get information, partly to get information, and that information may be used by the British.
In fairness, we have mounted a criminal investigation now about allegations that those who were extraordinarily rendered to Libya were tortured when they got to Libya. I think you and I might share misgivings about a future inquiry, in a detainee inquiry that's now been put on hold.
Can I just say, it only came out, that was only revealed because of a bomb which hit the offices of Gaddafi's security intelligence people in Tripoli.
Yes.
That's the only reason the evidence came out.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia, where we're discussing the US government's decision that there will be no prosecutions over the abuse of prisoners by CIA operatives. I'm Hywel Davies here in London. I'm joined by Charlie Wolf, an American broadcaster currently living in the UK, Richard Norton-Taylor, security editor at The Guardian newspaper, Keith Best, chief executive of Freedom from Torture, a charity that provides care for victims of torture. And on the phone from the United States, we have Alan Dershowitz, Felix Frankfurter professor of law at Harvard Law School. Alan Dershowitz in Harvard, you were going to say something?
Yes, the great lie that human rights people tell, and it's a deliberate and willful lie, is that torture never works. Here's the proof. During the Nazi regime, obviously, they tortured wonderful, brave members of the French resistance into making making them take these people to where their colleagues and friends and family members were hiding. We know for a fact that torture sometimes works. In the Philippines, they tortured a man for 47 days, and he revealed not only a plot to blow up 11 airliners, but to kill the Pope. Now, you don't believe what anybody says over torture. You say, take me to the evidence. And in those cases, he took them to the evidence. So let's put aside this absurd myth that torture doesn't work. This is a complicated problem. The people who say torture doesn't work are trying to pretend it's not an issue at all. If it didn't work, it wouldn't be used. It works sometimes. It may not work all that effectively, but it sometimes works. That's why it's a complicated moral issue.
You haven't
it's
even
not the simple-minded issue that you
haven't even
as.
followed your own administration's argument for using water. Well, if you just care to listen for a moment, you'll see that actually the argument that was being used by the US administration for applying waterboarding and these so-called enhanced interrogation techniques was actually not to elicit information. It was to soften people up so that they would then subsequently give information. So it was being done gratuitously as an act of torture without even the argument for saying that in itself it was going to elicit that information. So really, I'm afraid, not even your own administration actually agrees with you on that.
My own administration, I voted against that administration.
Well, I think you should do it more often, if I may say so.
I do. I am a liberal Democrat who opposes torture and who has figured out a way of finally doing something about it instead of just mouthing off about it and lying about how it doesn't work. I'm finally trying to get to the essence of how we can have accountability and responsibility for a very complicated moral issue. I believe waterboarding is torture. I believe we shouldn't do it, but I believe that every democracy in the world will do it if faced with.
So if you believe in accountability, do you therefore then deny this so-called doctrine, which you won't find anywhere in the US Constitution, of state secrets, whereby people who've been tortured, who've actually have been acknowledged as having been tortured, apprehended by the CIA and then tortured, are not allowed to bring their cases before the US courts?
Of course I disagree with that.
That's good.
I've written against state secrets, and of course we learn state secrets in Great Britain, which has an Official Secrets Act, which the United States does not.
Charlie Wolf, you were trying to get in.
I was just going to chime in to say that you were going on about the you call it torture, I call it waterboarding. The whole purpose of it, yes, was to soften them up, which subsequently did bring out that information. So it did have a utilitarian effect. You're
after 183 times, when in fact Khalid Sheikh Mohammed did not give any intelligence at all until a very considerable time after the final time he was waterboarded. Where's the nexus?
He was very intransigent.
You cannot show any nexus whatsoever there.
You're weakening your argument when you make it empirical, because that suggests that if it worked, it would be okay. You're much better off making the argument on moral grounds, conceding that it sometimes works, and saying it's wrong anyway.
Richard Norton-Taylor.
One of the practicalities and how it's counterproductive and why it happens, say, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think there are reasons for it. And that is that the American soldiers, and certainly the British soldiers, were not trained for those wars. Therefore, there's a question of responsibility. Is the responsibility on the generals, the military commanders in Britain or America, for that matter, their political masters,
or
and
the
their legal advice,
and
in American case, the government lawyers, and also in the British case, where it's quite devious, actually. You don't know quite who's talking straight on this. And lessons have been learned, I think, in Britain certainly, from our troops' record in Iraq and Afghanistan. And things which happened there, I don't think will happen again, partly because of the work of journalists and whistleblowers and what the courts have said.
But the greatest message about torture, which nobody's discussed so far, is how it diminishes the moral authority of those who apply it. And frankly, the last
that's why it's counterproductive.
Yes, the last US administration has now imperiled the lives of countless thousands of US citizens who travel abroad in a way that's going to take take probably more than a generation to overcome, to enable the US to regain the moral high ground again.
I think that's
basically what a country that tortures does is to descend into the same gutter as the terrorist. And it's very difficult, therefore, to counter the argument from other terrorist groups that if you do this as a so-called civilized nation, why can't we do it?
No, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Charlie. Can we let Charlie Wolf answer this? Alan
doesn't torture, the terrorists won't. That's an absurd argument.
Yeah, I mean, considering what the terrorists, and also just even to go back to a point Richard made about training, it's a fair point, but considering that we had a brand new form of warfare, unknown and following no form of any sort of laws of war.
Sorry.
When we're talking about acts of terrorism where we're putting planes into buildings and asymmetrical warfare, I think it changed, as Tony Blair said, it changed the rules of the game. We had to respond, and that's not saying you go out and start decimating cities. We didn't do that. We were very careful to follow the rules of the Geneva Convention and targeted bombings, etc. But we also had to gain information because we had civilian lives at stake. It's a new form of warfare.
Well, there are different ways of getting information. There's I've seen no evidence. Cheney says he told the British about, for example, the former Vice President Dick Cheney that he told the British security services about plans to bomb Heathrow Airport and the Docklands of London and gone. There's no evidence at all of that. In fact, the security service says they don't believe a word of what the claims were.
I think.
Sorry. Can I just let Alan talk?
Torture is as bad as terrorism. That waterboarding Sheikh Mohammed is as bad as flying a plane into the World Trade Center. That is absurd. Torturing guilty terrorists who are bragging about what they've done, wrong as it is, horrible as it is, pales by comparison to deliberately and willfully killing civilians. So the comparison between torturing guilty terrorists
I didn't make that comparison. I did not make that comparison. What I said is that those states who apply torture descend from the moral high ground. They no longer have the moral authority to pontificate about matters such as terrorism. I think you need to remember that we in Britain lived with terrorism in Northern Ireland decades before the awful tragedy of 9/11. And yes, there was evidence there that the British administration used torture in the maze and in some of the interrogation techniques. I mean, a large number of those were actually outlawed by Ted Heath years and years ago because they were seen not to be working. And moreover, not only were they not working in practical terms, i.e. we weren't getting the intelligence as a result of those techniques, but the worst thing was that they actually were counterproductive. They were renewing the support for the terrorists against the British government, and that's what you do.
Yes, the IRA in Northern Ireland, but also if you hear about Abu Ghraib, I don't know what influence Abu Ghraib has had, but certainly the treatment by the British, can't speak with the Americans here, in Iraq and Afghanistan has encouraged extremism, if you like, sometimes terrorist-minded people, influenced people to be both here in Britain as well as elsewhere.
Exactly. No, I'm sorry, because every bit of research I've seen as to what's the recruiting sergeant for terrorism has not been not Abu Ghraib, not Guantanamo Bay. In actual fact, what is the recruiting sergeant is the 9/11s. Anybody wants to be on the winning team. So when 9/11 happens, that's when the bin Ladens of the world were signing up jihadis. When they're losing, no one wants to join the losing team. So I'm sorry, Guantanamo Bay has not had the effect, and I'm sorry, waterboarding hasn't either. A lot of this has been perception. We're still looking at pictures of guys in orange suits. Orange suits was the very first day. As a matter of fact, the reason they had the pictures is because the U.S. Army and the public affairs effort was showing transparency, saying, look, we want to show you how we're treating these guys. The orange jumpsuits, well, you're on an airfield.
For the British security service.
No, but I mean, everything that was going on that's being deprecated. The orange jumpsuits, again, they're high visibility, either in case someone escapes or B, just because you're on an airfield. The goggles and the earplugs.
And the shackles?
They're prisoners. What else are you going to let them run free?
Well, it was a massive... those, I mean, if it really was done deliberately in order to show how humane the U.S. administration was, it was a massive own goal.
But should we complain when Anders Breivik...
Those pictures are being used as recruiting for people against the U.S.
But that's propaganda. propaganda?
I think
are we going to fall to propaganda?
One thing you would agree with me on, though, even though we're obviously at daggers drawn on other issues, is that sadly the use of torture by the US administration has certainly divided the Allies. It has certainly caused difficulties in what was previously a unified front against terrorism, and that is something that can only be of succour to the terrorists, and that I deeply regret.
No, I don't think. I'm sure there have been differences, but in any campaign, in any war, there will be differences between allies. We're a sovereign country. We decided that's how we were going to handle our prisoners. The British decided not to. I think we can agree to disagree. But as an American speaking, I had no problem with waterboarding. It did do what it was meant to do. And again, as I stated earlier, it was used in a very utilitarian, a very what's the word I'm looking for? Everybody wasn't tortured for the sake of torture. So to me, if you look at the definitions of torture, it was harsh. Yes, but we used the same techniques on our airmen. We used the same techniques on our Marines.
So you're going down a slippery slope, and there's got to be some absolute criterion of some kind, hasn't there? I mean, there's got to be some agreed, settled view of what constitutes torture. Otherwise, we're going down a slippery slope, and the exceptions are made everywhere.
No, well, it's not so much making exceptions. Again, as I studied it out, it met my requirements and my criterion that it wasn't torture. It was harsh, yes. And it was meant to be harsh. We were dealing with...
What are your criteria? Tell us what things we're allowed to do and aren't allowed to do under your criteria.
It had a purpose to it. It was used selectively. Again, as I said...
But what things? Doing what exact things? Hanging people up for days? Keeping them awake for days?
Listen, a lot of it was theater. It didn't cause permanent damage, which was one of the criterion used by the government.
How do you know that?
Because again...
Have you seen the psychiatric records of these people who've been... Because we deal with that every day, you see. We care for victims of torture throughout the world. And I have got an army of clinicians. You may be very well qualified in many matters, but you're not qualified in this. And I can produce for you an army of clinicians who will tell you the lasting effects of torture are ones that are horrendous.
I'm sure
and
they do.
Waterboarding does have that particular effect.
Depending on how
drowning.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia, where we're discussing the US government's decision that there will be no prosecutions over the abuse of prisoners by CIA operatives. I'm joined by Charlie Wolf, an American broadcaster currently living in the UK, Richard Norton-Taylor, security editor at The Guardian newspaper, Keith Best, chief executive of Freedom from Torture, a charity that provides care for victims of torture. And on the phone from the United States, we have Alan Dershowitz, Felix Frankfurter professor of law at Harvard Law School. I'd like to turn a little bit towards the Obama administration. What do you make of their decision not to carry on any prosecutions of anyone involved with the torturing that might or might not have gone on?
Well, I think there's a big difference between accountability and using the criminal process. The criminal process is not designed to decide historically what happened. It's designed to establish beyond a reasonable doubt by the use of admissible evidence that a crime specifically defined in advance has occurred. And the criminal prosecution is a blunderbuss way of holding people accountable, because had there been a trial, most likely there would have been an acquittal, and then it really would have validated what went on. So I can't be too critical of the administration's decision not to bring criminal charges. What I am critical of is of the decision not to find accountability, not to decide who authorized it, not to have administrative sanctions, not to have visibility. That's why I favor a torture warrant, because precisely the kinds of debates we've been having here would have to occur every time the government sought a warrant. Is it torture? Is waterboarding torture? How long will it be used for? What's the purpose? Will it be validated? And then if it is done and if it's unlawful, we know precisely who signed on and who didn't sign on.
Can I just say, in Europe, it is much, much easier and much clearer, because it's settled down in not only the European Convention of Human Rights, but in many court cases and judgments and rulings by very senior certainly British Chief Justices. Now, torture has nothing to do with the criminal justice at all, by definition, because certainly in Britain and Europe, certainly in Britain, you cannot use any evidence from torture, which is torture based on what we agree is torture, as evidence in a court of law.
This wasn't used for court of law.
We're talking about prosecution of those who do the torturing. You need valid evidence to prosecute them.
I understand
and I'm saying that's not the best way to get accountability.
Can I just very quickly ask, as a layman now, Alan Dershowitz, a question? In essence, isn't that what happens if the president was advised by his Justice Department and he signed it off? Is not the accountability there? Is that not what you were talking about?
I think the one thing you did have in the Bush administration was some degree of accountability, and we're saying that we know we can hold the Bush administration accountable and responsible for waterboarding because there are memos that say it was approved, the president signed off on it, the vice president signed off on it, and the American people responded by voting them out of office.
Well, I think it's a very interesting case happening in Britain, which may actually push the law forward as a result of what was discovered by MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, and their role in abducting dissident Libyans, that's to say Libyans opposed to Gaddafi.
Who happen to be in government now.
To Gaddafi, yeah, who happen to be leaders of Tripoli.
It's not a first.
Anyhow, so there's a police investigation in Britain into the role of security intelligence, the British security officials and ministers, because according to the Constitution, at least the law, the Foreign Secretary is responsible for the activity, all the activities actually of the Secret Intelligence Service. Now, if they suggest, the MI6 people, the Secret Intelligence Service people in Britain, that we were authorised by ministers. Now, that's going to be very interesting, and I think there's a police investigation, and sooner or later...
Well, as you know,
some evidence will go to at least to that point of accountability.
Well, as you know, the uncomfortable thing for ministers in the last administration is that we know from the evidence given in civil cases where people who've been extraordinarily rendered have been suing the British government, and the British government's been very anxious to settle those out of court. So there is no actual finding, but we know from the evidence given there that any act of extraordinary rendition of somebody being sent to a foreign country for interrogation purposes had to be authorised by the Foreign Secretary of the day. So
whether they were or not another, we don't know.
Whether exactly in any particular case, but it certainly has the capacity to make politicians very accountable for what they do. But I would just like to come back to Mr. Dershowitz about the fact that accountability can be held always in the political rather than the legal arena. I'm sorry, I make an obvious point as a lawyer myself. That frankly it is only by the law very often that you actually force a dissident administration or one that wishes to hide its skeletons in the cupboard to bring those forward. We should really not diminish the role of the law, the capacity of the law to overcome some of these doctrines like state secrets and such like.
I agree completely, but the criminal law is often an awkward way of doing it. There are better ways to do it. As you say, in England it's through civil lawsuits.
Yes, well that may well be.
But tragically, civil lawsuits can be settled out of court, and then you don't have the real accountability.
Let's also remember, as far as the Bush administration was concerned, there is and was congressional oversight. The CIA had briefed the intelligence committees. I think the system did work. Though the many senators and congressmen.
Okay, I'm sorry. We've run out of time, I'm afraid. So, but in the end, no one has been prosecuted for any events taking place.
It was a witch. The reason was it was a witch hunt. This thing was reviewed by career attorneys at the Justice Department under the Bush years. Holder knew it wasn't going to fly. He did it for political reasons, and that's the sad part about it.
I hope that if the evidence is there as a result of the criminal investigation going on now into what happened in Libya, if the evidence is there to prosecute somebody or persons who were responsible for that will be done in this country, and I hope that Britain will actually set the way for the rest of the world for showing that you cannot hide from the law, however high you may be.
I'm afraid that's all we have. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. So thank you all very much for joining me. I was joined by Charlie Wolfe, an American broadcaster, Richard Norton-Taylor, security editor at The Guardian, Keith Best, chief executive of Freedom from Torture, and Alan Dershowitz, professor of law at Harvard Law School. Thank you all very much for taking part in a fractious discussion.